Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in today's lesson, we'll focus on Ephesians. Let's begin by sharing the screen and going to the PowerPoint slides. Thus far, we have looked at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And beginning today in this lesson, we want to focus on Ephesians, but we're beginning to look at 4 letters that collectively are known as the prison epistles: Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. So before we begin looking at the content of Ephesians, let's understand why these are called the prison epistles. In Romans 15, Paul laid out his plan for the future. What he wanted to do was go to Spain and preach. Paul was in Corinth. He was writing the letter to the church in Rome, but he was explaining to them, my real goal is to go to Spain. That's where I want to preach next. However, he told the Romans, chapter 15, verses 25 through 28, first I need to go to Jerusalem. I've been gathering money to take a collection to the Christians in Jerusalem who are struggling financially. I need to go to Jerusalem. I'll drop the money off. As soon as I've done that, I'm going to head to Spain. And along the way, I'm going to stop in Rome and visit with you. That's my plan. Well, if we want to understand Paul's trip from Greece, from Corinth to Jerusalem, we can pick that up in Acts chapter 20. Verses 3 through 6. Paul thought he would get on a ship in Greece, again, not far from Corinth, and he could sail to Jerusalem and deliver the money. But there was a plot detected to harm Paul, really to kill Paul in Greece. And so the decision was made we're not going to sail from Greece. We will go north into Macedonia, up around the area of Philippi. And from Philippi, then we'll begin the trip to Jerusalem. Well, he made it to Jerusalem, and technically he would not have sailed all the way to Jerusalem. He would have sailed to probably Caesarea and then walked the remaining distance to Jerusalem. But he made it to Jerusalem. He met with the leaders of the church there, gave them an update on his work. They were very glad to hear the progress that was being made. He deliver the money to them. It's not explicitly stated in Acts chapter 21, but it's implied that the offering, the money that had been collected, was delivered to the church leaders in Jerusalem. And then the leaders there in Jerusalem said to Paul, you know, we're really glad you're here. We're glad to hear from you. We're glad to be given an update on your work. While you're in Jerusalem, though, our advice to you is to lay low. There are people here who do not like you. They hate your guts. They would like nothing more than to harm you. And so initially that's what Paul did. But within a week, Paul was in the temple and he was spotted by some Jews who were from Asia. They, they threw him out of the temple. That got the crowd stirred up. And as the crowd started getting stirred up, word got to the Roman officials that something was happening down at the temple. And that created an uprising. And so the guards came and they took Paul away. In chapters 22 through 26 of Acts, Paul gets passed from one Roman official to another. And this goes on for quite a while. And eventually, Paul, realizing that he's not really going to get a fair shake in that part of the Roman Empire, he appeals to Caesar. That's Acts chapter 25, verse 11. And as a Roman citizen, Paul was certainly entitled to do that. Now, whether that means that Paul would actually be able to plead his case before Caesar or before one of Caesar's lieutenants is unclear. But as a Roman citizen, he could appeal to Caesar, which means he would be sent to Rome. What's interesting to note is in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, that Paul had had a vision where the Lord had said to him, Paul, I want you in Rome. I want you to preach in Rome. So Paul knew that he was going to Rome. He just didn't know the circumstances that would actually deliver him to Rome. Let's pause for just a second. And let's share a different screen and just get our bearings geographically. So again, this is Corinth. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from Corinth. It was then his plan to sail from Corinth down to Jerusalem. And you can see Jerusalem is not on the water, so he would have sailed to here and then walked the rest of the way. A plot was detected to kill Paul here. So Paul walked north, and then he sailed from Philippi down to Jerusalem. Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, kind of got bounced around to different Roman officials, and then finally appealed to Caesar in Rome. And while that should have been a fairly straight trip, as you read in Acts, you would find that that trip actually it was quite eventful, had some stops along the way, had a shipwreck, etc. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint slides. And again, Acts chapter 27 and 28 tell us of the details of the trip to Rome. And then as we come to the end of Acts, there are 28 chapters in the book of Acts. The next to the last verse in Acts tells us that Paul was under house arrest for 2 years in Rome. And that's as far as Acts takes the story. But that's how Paul ended up being in prison. And that's why we would call these the prison epistles, because technically, though Paul was not in a dungeon, he was not in a cell, he was under house arrest, but still, these are called the prison epistles. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And you'll notice the 2-year period of time. Ephesians being written in 60 AD, all the way to Philippians being written in 62. So most scholars believe that the 4 letters called the prison epistles were written while Paul was under house arrest in Rome. Okay, let's talk about the city of Ephesus. Paul had traveled through Ephesus at the end of his second missionary journey, where he taught for a short period of time. This is Acts chapter 18. And he left Priscilla and Aquila there to continue the ministry. Paul returned to Ephesus on his third missionary journey, Acts chapter 19, and that's when he had a run-in with the silversmith Demetrius, and more about that in just a moment. When Paul was sailing from Philippi to Jerusalem with the collection that he was taking to the Christians in Jerusalem, one of the stops was near Ephesus, a place called Miletus or Miletus. And when they stopped there, Paul sent message to the elders in Ephesus to come down and visit with him, and they did. That's Acts chapter 20, verses 17 through 38. Ephesus itself was a very large city. Only Rome and Alexandria were larger. There were 250,000 people who lived in Ephesus proper. It was the capital of Asia Minor. It was an important seaport. It was a multi-ethnic city. And it was very polytheistic, though Artemis was the most important deity figure in the city. There was a temple to Artemis in Ephesus, and the silversmiths, including Demetrius, made quite a living by crafting little statues made out of silver of Artemis and selling them. And so in Acts chapter 19, verse 26, the silversmiths are quite upset because Paul tells the people, why are you worshiping these little things that are made by people? Why don't you worship the real God? Well, as Paul was saying that, what he really was doing through the eyes of the silversmiths was cutting in on their bottom line. And so they were quite upset with Paul for saying that. The letter itself is interesting in a couple different ways. First of all, there are no personal references in Ephesians. Many of Paul's letters, when you get to the last chapter, he includes some greetings. Be sure to say hi to so-and-so. Send my greetings to the household of so-and-so. But that doesn't happen in Ephesians. In fact, the only name you see in the last chapter of Ephesians is Tychicus. And Tychicus was the individual who was carrying the letter from Paul in Rome to the Christians in Ephesus. Paul doesn't address a specific crisis, unlike say, First and Second Thessalonians, or unlike First and Second Corinthians. There wasn't an issue in particular that Paul was addressing. Instead, he focuses on foundational information that's applicable to any church, whether it's a first century church or a 21st century church. He begins by talking about grace. Chapter 1 and chapter 2, including chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, the wonderful verse that says, "For it is by grace we've been saved through faith, and it's a gift from God. It's not because of anything we have done, so we can't boast about what we've earned. Grace is a free gift from God." In chapter 4, Paul talks about oneness in the church. Now, the significance of this was that the church at Ephesus was a series of house churches scattered across the city as well as some of the surrounding towns. And that was not uncommon, that most of the churches at that time did not have one main building where everyone came. But keep in mind, Ephesus had 250,000 people in it, plus the small town surrounding it. So there were a lot of house churches. And Paul was trying to communicate to them, even though you're meeting in these small groups around town, you're still one church. There's a unity in the church. Paul focuses on moral conduct. We should keep in mind this was a polytheistic city. He tells them things that seem fairly basic, but were very important to reinforce. Tell the truth. Don't sin when you're angry. If you used to be a thief, stop it. Get a job. Use your words to build people up. Be kind and forgive each other. In chapter 5, Paul talks about the Christian household. Wives, here's how you're to act. Husbands, here's how you're to act. Fathers, here's how you're to act. Children, here's how you are to act. And then he also includes a couple of verses about slaves and slave owners. And the importance of that is that in the Roman world, it's been estimated that at least 1/3, and possibly more than 1/3 of the population in the Roman Empire were slaves. And in some cases, because churches were primarily house churches, slaves and slave owners were worshiping together in the same house church. And so Paul felt the need to remind both the slaves and the slave owners that they both answer to a higher master in heaven. And finally, chapter 6 talks about the armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. These are things that are taught to children in Bible class or maybe in vacation Bible school, and then they craft a little sword out of cardboard and aluminum foil, or they make a little helmet. And it's a great way to introduce children to Scripture. What we probably didn't tell the kids, though, was the reason why we need the armor of God, and that comes 2 verses earlier, where Paul says, we're not really fighting against flesh and blood. As Christians, the struggle is really against powers in the unseen world, spiritual forces that are well beyond us and what we can do. And so in order to be able to survive in that battle, we need the full armor of God to help us. Well, that's our introduction to Ephesians. I hope you'll take some time this week to read through the letter. It has 6 chapters in it. And I think that you will get a fresh perspective on some of the things that you may have heard before as you have had Bible classes or read through Ephesians. In our next lesson, we will focus on Colossians. I hope you can join us.